Recording has been started.
Good morning, everyone in United States, and good evening to our esteemed speaker who is in India. We welcome all of you.
Your voice is not clear, Adityanjee.
We welcome all of you for yet another session of CSA Distinguished Lecture Series. And we have today Professor Srikanth Kondapalli as our distinguished speaker. Those of you who registered using our flyer probably saw this flyer, and it tells you topic for today's lecture. It is China's posture on Ukraine war. War in Ukraine has been there officially since February 24, 2022, although some will dispute the onset of this war. A little bit about Council for Strategic Affairs. Council for Strategic Affairs imparts education in the field of international relations. The Council fosters discussion, dialogue, and debate on geopolitical issues. CSA encourages strategic studies in general to raise the level of awareness. Council condemns terrorism in all forms worldwide. And finally, CSA aims to contribute towards world peace and prosperity. Those of you who are interested in getting more details, please visit our website www.councilforstrategicaffairs.org. We do two programs every month. First is a monthly roundtable discussion that is held on the second Saturday of each month at 10 a.m. Eastern Day Time, and then monthly guest lecture by a domain expert on fourth Saturday of each month at the same time. We also organize symposia, meetings, and conferences. We promote publications of articles on geopolitics and related subjects. And we do have a summer internship program for college students if anyone is interested. As we will be introduced to our distinguished speaker today, this is the picture of Professor Kondapalli. I must say that we are deeply honored to have India's topmost academic China expert speaking for us today. Professor Kondapalli is the Dean of School of International Studies and Professor in Chinese Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. He was the chairman of Center for East Asia Studies, School of International Studies, JNU from 2008 to 2010, 2012 to 2014, 2016 to 2018, and 2018 to 2020. He got his education in China studies, both in India and China, with a Ph.D. in Chinese studies. He learned the Chinese language while he was at Beijing Language and Cultural University and was a post-doctoral visiting fellow at People's University, Beijing from 1996 to 1998. He has been a visiting professor at a number of institutions, both in Communist China as well as in Republic of China, which is Taiwan. He has still several faculty appointments. I'm not going to read them out. He has written a number of books and monographs. Two of his books are China's Military, the Period in Transition, and China's Naval Power. He has written monographs and co-edited a number of volumes, and he has written a number of journal articles and edited volumes all on China. So he has a dedicated focus on China studies. He has received several awards. He received the prestigious K. Subramaniam Award in 2010 for excellence in research in strategic and security studies. He's also guest faculty at Indian Armed Forces units, including at the National Defense College, Army War College, College of Air Warfare, College of Naval Warfare, and College of Defense Management. He's a distinguished fellow at several think tanks, including Vivekananda International Foundation and Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies. He has supervised more than 30 PhD researchers at JMU and is also an academic advisor for PhD researchers at Al-Farabi Kazakh National University and Ablai Khan University at Almaty and Tan Khan University in Taipei. He is editor of JNU's School of International Studies Journal. So we are very honored to have him come back again at CSA platform. I will introduce the topic a little bit. Everything about China is guarded in or shrouded in mystery and opacity. Actually, there is no Chinese character for word transparency. We know Xi Jinping was in Moscow very recently, and this picture shows you Xi Jinping and the Grand Kremlin Palace. And here you see Xi Jinping shaking hands with Putin. But is the story that simple? In one of the publications on China's posture in Ukraine war, somebody said Putin and Xi showed up Sino-Russian alliance despite differing agendas. So we'll be hearing from Professor Kondapalli as to what is China's agenda vis-a-vis Ukraine war. A couple of housekeeping rules. Everyone except our distinguished speakers should remain muted to avoid noise interference. Please change your cell phone setting to vibration mode. Please, on any cost, not interrupt our esteemed speaker when he's speaking. Only those members of the audience who identify themselves openly will be allowed to ask questions. No anonymous questioners, please. All the questions are moderated and have to be submitted through chat. Nobody can ask questions directly. Questions have to be very precise and specific. You cannot send a lecture in the form of comments in the chat function. Lastly, this program, like all our programs, is being recorded and it would be available on our website as well as on our YouTube channel within the next 24 hours. And with this introduction, I'm delighted to introduce our distinguished speaker, Professor Kondapalli, to the Council for Strategic Affairs once again. Namaste, and thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adityanjee, and distinguished participants in this webinar. I really thank the organizers, the Council for Strategic Affairs, for giving me this opportunity to interact with you on the China's relations with Russia, Ukraine, with focus on the Ukrainian conflict. Fundamentally, I think the February 24 last year, when the war erupted, the Chinese have been under tremendous surprise because initially, when on February 4th last year, when Putin and Xi met just before the Winter Olympics, both the presidents of Russia and China, they have had a vision. It is reported that President Putin said that he will wind up the war in about 3 days. That is the understanding between the two sides. And we do not know exactly the details of that conversation, but this is what I heard from some of the diplomats. And the next week, after the war has actually begun, on February 24th, a major general of the Russian army said that they would finish the war in about a week time. We are in March 25th, 2023. That's more than 1 year of the war that has erupted. So this is very surprising to China because China thought that the Russian military, although it used to be the inheritor of the superpower Soviet Union previously, and formidable military power, was unable to conduct the special military operations as they claim in any swift manner. On the other hand, the Chinese were also surprised with the number of casualties and the kind of destruction and the kind of impact the Ukrainian conflict had shown, including an estimated 200,000 Russians killed and an estimated 620,000 Ukrainians killed, besides 8 million Ukrainians being displaced as refugees in different parts of the Eastern Europe. Poland, Romania, Hungary, and other countries bore the brunt of this war with the kind of migration that has been seen in the last 1 year. The Chinese were also surprised with the kind of reverses Russia faced in the Ukrainian conflict because the Chinese had ambitions to invade Taiwan, and many have identified Taiwan scenario as a kind of quid pro quo between President Putin and President Xi in the light of the last week's March 20 to 22nd visit by President Xi to Moscow. They thought that there is a quid pro quo between the two sides. The Chinese would support Russia on the Ukrainian conflict, while the Russians would support the Chinese on the Taiwanese front in the cross straits. So that has also become quite a problematic because of the reverses that Russia faced in Ukrainian conflict. So fundamentally, the Chinese were surprised with the conflict as such unfolding, and the inability of Russia to clinch the matters as promised before in 3 days or in a week at the most. So this is number one. Number two is China's national interests and China's strategic goals became strained in the current conflict. And so it evoked a very sharp response from the Chinese side. China's national interests include the protection of their core interests, as they claim, and that include, of course, in this case, in relation to Ukraine, in terms of the Taiwan Straits. Number two, in terms of Xinjiang, where the region is pretty close to Ukraine, as the crow flies in the Eurasian region. So the dynamics of that region would also impact on Xinjiang. Just to the viewers, the 2016-17 on human rights violation in Xinjiang, and subsequently the Geneva-based Human Rights Council passed strictures on China on the Xinjiang Uyghur issue by suggesting that 1 million people are incarcerated, and European Parliament, the US Congress passed sanctions on the Communist Party members in Xinjiang, and China retaliated by also having its own sanctions on these European Parliament members, and a few other Americans, including the former Secretary of State. So, in other words, the Xinjiang issue is also a part of this impact of Ukrainian fallout. But primarily, it is related to Taiwan from the Chinese national interests. Number two, China's national interests include the kind of political system that China is in system, which means the NATO and colored revolution part of the democracy and others. Since the Maidan incident in Ukraine, this has created the overall background for political system. Dai Pinko, a former state councillor that is slightly higher than a foreign minister's position in China, in 2006, speaking at the US-China Strategic and 2006, mentioned that China's national interests include the primacy of the political system that it follows, including the Communist Party. Interests, which include obviously Taiwan, Tibet, South China Sea, and to China Sea in 2009, and to Senkaku Islands with Japan. From Chinese point of view, and this is a major item. But in terms of the political system, the NATO expansion and the colored revolutions would have some impact on the authoritarian system. As you know, late Trump onwards, there has been a lot of stress on promoting democracy in China, and various measures were undertaken. The Communist Party was targeted by the former Secretary of State, Pompeo, and subsequently, there was also the overall posturing on the Communist Party-led party state apparatuses working in China, including those espionage charges, influence operations, and so on and so forth. So in the light of the interests and the colored revolutions, the national interests of China would demand that they also have Russia in relation to the NATO expansion. So the Russian critique of the Ukrainian conflict included NATO expansion. I'm saying this because President Putin made three main conditions. First is opposing the NATO expansion. Number two, the deployment of ballistic missile systems in the Russian neighborhood. And thirdly, he also mentioned, as is denazification of Ukraine domestic policy. Is this clear now, my voice? Is there any disruption in the...
There was, but not disruption.
All right, I think I should come closer to the microphone, and I hope this is now better.
Yeah, it is better now.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for pointing it out. So the core interests have been one of the main reasons for the Chinese involvement in the conflict indirectly, and its posturing in the United Nations Security Council, General Assembly, in the Geneva-based Human Rights Council. Also, in terms of the recent state councillor visit to Europe to shore up support for China's position. Secondly, the 12-point peace proposal that has been mentioned as part of a paper that the Foreign Ministry released on the first anniversary of the Russian actions on Ukraine on February 24th. The Foreign Ministry came out with a 12-point peace proposal, which I would just mention in a while, read out a few aspects of those. So that is number one concern of China in terms of the national interest. Number two is the strategic goals of China. And here the situation becomes much more complex because China's strategic goals, as mentioned in the 16th Communist Party Congress in 2002, is to build a well-off society village, well-off society. And as a part of this, they have mentioned about the per capita income increase, which is currently around $11,000, and social welfare, healthcare, education, the SDGs that were outlined in the UN format. So those are the goals that China has, strategic goals till 2021. And at the 19th Communist Party Congress, they mentioned about the 2049 socialist modernization as their strategic goal, which means the conflict in Ukraine will have a lot of disturbance to this goal. Number one is because one of the Chinese goals, as I just mentioned, is the well-off society construction, which they claim they have already constructed. Yet, when you look at the basic data, the American per capita income is around $45,000. The Chinese is about $10,000. So huge discrepancy in terms of the per capita income. And if China has to graduate towards the and overcome the middle income trap, they need to cross over to at least $25,000, which is quite a tall order currently with the Ukrainian conflict. Even though China's trade with the United States, with NATO partners, with other countries is pretty high, there is a tariff war that is unleashed by the Trump administration, which the Biden administration has continued. One doesn't know the actual fallout of the tariff wars, but if the Sino-US relations get affected with these tariff wars, for example, last year, China had $690 billion trade with the United States and around $900 billion with European Union, all those 29 countries in EU, and with other partners as well, say Japan, South Korea, who are the allies of the United States and Australia. The trade is quite substantial. So one of the strategic goals of China is to keep this income rising based on exports. While Ukrainian conflict and the COVID-19 have disrupted the trade of China, although there isn't much as of now yet in terms of the figures, it is expected that with the recent change in the supply chain resilience initiative agreement, India, Japan, Australia, or the diversion of the supply chains would have probably created some tension for China in the trade front and the economic front. Already we saw last year China's growth 3% officially, and World Bank estimated 2.4% the growth rate. And this year, the National People's Congress in March suggested about 5.5% growth rate. So that indicates that China's strategic goal of building a well-off society or a socialist modernization will become problematic if the Ukrainian conflict drags on, number one. Number two, President Xi Jinping mentioned in the Davos meeting that China wants to be the leader of globalization. And this process of globalization has been reversed with various protectionist measures, as well as with the Ukrainian fallout in terms of sanctions on Russia and sanctions on China. For example, the October 6th last year, United States imposed a $130 billion semiconductor chips ban on Huawei, ZTE, and other companies in violation, as they allegedly violated some of the UNSC laws, sanctions on North Korea, Iran, and others. So, in the light of these, the the uh, the Chinese have now come under tremendous pressure on the globalization aspect, which actually benefited China's economy. WTO entry and others have really benefited China. So, this is one strategic goal. The third strategic goal is to reunify with Taiwan. This has been mentioned in the 19th Communist Party Congress and 20th Communist Party Congress in 2017 and 2022. And also, President Xi Jinping mentioned this in the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party in July 2021. In the light of the Ukrainian conflict and the understanding that if Russia is given a free rein in Ukraine, the Chinese would also get a free rein in Taiwan Straits. Of course, Ukraine cannot be compared with the Taiwan Strait scenario because Ukraine has a land border, which is the main contention in Donbass and Crimea since 2014. In the case of Taiwan, there is a 185 nautical mile water moat which has to be crossed, and Taiwan had deployed mines across these straits. In addition, of course, Taiwan has a very modern armed forces. And thirdly, the Taiwanese also have the standoff weapon systems like Xiongfang cruise missiles. The third and fourth version have also been developed by Taiwan. And most important, Taiwan controls today, or rather generates, about 40% of global hardware, which means that any war in Taiwan Straits would have a major disruption for you and me as well, in addition to, of course, Taiwan and China. China is going ahead with the digitalization in the 14th Five-Year Plan, and that would be disrupted if there is an invasion of Taiwan. Having said that, there is also the assessment that Taiwan can stand on its own for about 3 months in relation to the any adventurous action by China in Taiwan Straits. So the strategic goals of China then would be disturbed, and that would be problematic for China's rise itself. And so the speculation that China would invade Taiwan as a part of the Ukrainian scenario, I think is misplaced to a large extent, because Taiwan can impose heavy costs on China, including possibly to the disintegration of the Communist Party in China if things were to go beyond that. We are discounting any United States support to Taiwan in this, and Taiwan itself can defend on its own with the kind of modernized weapon systems, as well as the kind of assets that it has. We also should not forget that 2 million Taiwanese live in China, and that would be problematic for China in the longer run in terms of the kind of disturbances that may erupt in that scenario. So the Chinese strategic goals would be problematic overall with the Ukrainian conflict. In my assessment, China would go slow on the so-called Taiwan invasion scenario. Although 6 areas could be identified how China can invade Taiwan, including a submarine blockade, which would be less costly for China, but also costly for China in the sense of shipping and insurance rates going up. Secondly, there is aviation, usage across the Taiwan Straits. China today has many weapon systems like J-20, J-11, the Lavi project, Israeli Lavi project, which has been channelized into the J-10 aircraft and others. So aviation is one area where the Chinese could impose heavy costs on the Taiwanese. A third is overall invasion, which would be problematic given the kind of 80 nautical miles of the water difference between the mainland China and Taiwan. A fourth is the C4SR attacks, paralysis of the command control communications computers, and intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance activities, and paralyzing the Taiwanese C4ISR, and also the saturation strikes by the ballistic missiles that are located in Fujian and Zhejiang provinces on different airfields, first in Taiwan, and also on strategic assets like the President's Palace or others. However, it is likely that Taiwan can hold, even though soon after Nancy Pelosi's visit in August, China had targeted 6 areas closer to Taiwan Straits. But Taiwan exhibited much more maturity and confidence in addressing these issues. And it looks like the Chinese desperation would cost it more in the near future. So this is the broader framework on what the Chinese think about the Ukrainian conflict. Let me give briefly the issues related to the actual events in Ukraine and the Chinese response in this regard. One aspect is in terms of Ukraine, there is the Chinese concept of Tao Guang Yang Hui, which is basically keep a low profile. And during Xi Jinping's tenure since 2012, a new concept, Fan Fa Yo Wei, or the accomplishing something, has been mentioned. But most important, in the 19th Party Congress, Xi Jinping also suggested that China should occupy the center stage, which means basically then Ukrainian conflict would be configured in the overall framework of this regional dominance, and any failure of Russia, and we have not seen Russia clinching the matters in Ukraine so far. So any decline of Russia, any defeat of Russia in the Ukrainian conflict would be seen as an opportunity for China, because that would have removed a big, strong military neighbor in the north, and so conducive for China's interests. So this is one thinking process that China would probably be dishing out. Second is, like Russians, the Chinese have also critiqued the NATO expansion, and they cited the Minsk agreements as the basis for the Ukrainian conflict to be resolved. And they also China opposed the sanctions on Russia, as these were contributing to the food, fuel, fertilizer prices increase. And this is one of the key arguments that China has put forward. But essentially, it's a pro-Russian kind of position. As a result of this, China had imported a lot of energy resources from Russia, $35 billion in 2021, increasing to about $60 billion. And last week, Russia became the largest exporter of crude oil to China, displacing Saudi Arabian contribution to the Chinese imports. And nearly 2/3 of these transactions are conducted in the renminbi, Chinese currency transactions, which also means that both Russia and China are looking at depleting the US dollar as the global currency. It's a tall order currently, but that is a baby step that they are making in that direction. Then there is the high-level visits from China to Russia. Last September, there was a visit by Li Chanshu, the former Politburo Standing Committee member and a points person for Xi Jinping in his interactions with Russia. Li Chanshu is seen closer to the Russian leadership, and has been instrumental in many close conversations between China and Russia. So Li Chanshu's visit on September 7 last year, in this, the video clippings suggested that Li Chanshu supported Russia's need to secure its core interests. This aspect has been reiterated in the joint statement on March 21st last week, that core interests of each side should be respected and supported. So which means in this video conversation, Li Chanshu mentions about China's support to the Russian actions in Ukraine. So that's quite explicit endorsement of Russia in the conflict. State Councilor Wang Yi visited the United Nations Security Council on September 22nd and mentioned about sovereignty as a key aspect in China's, which is reiterated in the 12-point peace plan and also on other occasions by the Chinese Foreign Ministry and by the Chinese leaders, including in the joint statement last week between China and Russia, between President Xi Jinping and President Putin. And this concept is problematic because India just has gone through the Galwan incident in June 2020. Previously, the Chinese would suggest that this is a dispute since the 1962 conflict and specifically from 1980 discussions between the two officials, that this is a disputed territory. And suddenly, during the Galwan incident, China changed its position by saying that this is China's sovereign territory. So huge change in China's perception. Also, the Chinese have been saying about Arunachal Pradesh as part of southern Tibet since 2004-5 in their official documents. So there has been a radical shift in China's position, suddenly claiming sovereignty over these areas, although previously they mentioned these as disputed territories. So this is one problematic. Second is, just a day before Xi Jinping's visit to Moscow, China's Ministry of Natural Resources, it identified Vladivostok with a Chinese name, Khabarovsk and Siberia as well, as they put up Chinese names for this, indicating that the problem stop only at Japan or Vietnam, Philippines, and India, but also they have these claims on Russia, which is going to be a key bilateral issue in the coming future. If there is a quid pro quo between China and Russia on Ukraine and Taiwan, if China gives a free rein to Russia in Ukraine, to the Chinese on the Taiwan, it is also likely that Russia may forego its Siberian region to the Chinese domination in the coming future, depending on how strong, how weak Russia is post-Ukrainian conflict. So this is one scenario that one can draw, and detrimental, of course, to the Russian interests. China also made a lot of mediation calls with France, with Germany, with Hungary, with Finland, and during the Munich Security Conference, there is an effort again to renew that negotiation with the mediator between Russia and Ukraine. But many Europeans see China as not an innocent mediator. They think that China has close relations with Russia. And so there are very few takers for China's mediatory role in this. It is also believed that it is also reported by the Wall Street Journal that soon after the visit to Moscow, Xi Jinping would be speaking to Zelensky. But we have not heard anything about that now. Now that Xi Jinping has gone back home, we have not heard about the phone call or the virtual meeting between the two sides. compared to India, which had spoken to both Russia during the Samarkand meeting of the SCO, when Prime Minister Modi mentioned to President Putin that this is not an era of war and peace and stability should prevail over this region, Eurasian region. The Chinese have not spoken to the Ukrainian side, unlike Prime Minister Modi, who had spoken to Mr. Zelensky. So in this context, it is quite obvious that China has been veering more closer to Russia than to the Ukrainian conflict. I will mention in a while about the Chinese interest in Ukraine, but I was mentioning the broader aspects right now. There is also the Biden administration warning the Chinese not to support Russia in the conflict over Ukraine. It is said that since Russia lost so many young people, they have a national mobilization of over 300,000 fresh recruitments, and there is the material equipment that is in shortage. So it is reported that Russia took support from North Korea and Iran in these weapon systems. And it is also believed that China could be the next player in supporting Russia in the military, equipment. So in the process, we saw that President Biden warned Xi Jinping not to provide any material support because China is heavily dependent on the United States for its own rejuvenation in economic rejuvenation aspects. And hence, this is one crucial factor that needs to be. However, it was reported that China had supplied some parts to the Su-35 fighter aircraft program in Russia. There are also high-resolution satellite images supplied by a Changsha-based. Changsha is the capital of Hunan province, where Mao Zedong hailed from. So the high-resolution satellite images were also, according to this report, was given by the Chinese to Russia last year. And this resulted in the American sanctions on the Chinese firms, concerned Chinese firms. So the explicit Chinese positions have also evoked a lot of differences among the Chinese. For example, Kung Fangxin, a major general in the National Defense University, he opposed the Russian actions on Ukraine by suggesting that this would have a negative impact on China's rise itself. And there is, of course, the collateral damage. Fu Zong, for example, the ambassador of China to the European Union, he's stated that there would be collateral damages for China as the conflict intensifies. And we have also seen the wolf warrior diplomacy taking a backseat in China. Many of those wolf warrior diplomats like Chao Lijian, Hua Chunying, and others have been relegated to the background. Le Yucheng, who served in New Delhi as the ambassador, also because of his comments on the limitless partnership with Russia, they have been relegated to the background. So it indicates that there is a lot of churning out process within China in terms of the discussions over Ukraine. What are the opportunities and challenges for China? The death toll and all-round destruction has increased in the last one year, 13 months. So there is a call for negotiations, specifically as food prices have increased in China. There is the call for negotiations, and China sees this as an opportunity if China is ensconced in the mediatory role. But that prospect has not really resulted in, and so there are concerns for China. A victory for the Russian side would be good for China in terms of any anti-Western partnership in the multipolarity, as the statement mentions last week. And there is the concern, of course, for Russia on the Chinese taking over Siberian resources and regions with demographic change, etc. A prolonged conflict in Ukraine could bleed Russia. This is one scenario where China could lose its diplomatic ally in Moscow and also the multipolar partner, and possibly become the target of the United States, like Ronald Reagan once mentioned, Satan. China could be the next Satan if Putin and Russia, get very negative consequences out of this Ukrainian conflict. In terms of China-Ukraine bilateral relations, they have about $20 billion trade and $200 million investments in agriculture, in harbor, in telecommunications by the Huawei. So it's a touch and go for China in Ukraine. But one of the most interesting things is that when Putin and Lavrov mentioned about possible nuclear factor in the Ukrainian conflict, it is interesting to note that China concluded a nuclear agreement with Ukraine with visiting President Viktor Yanukovych in 2013. The commentators mentioned at the time that this is an extended nuclear deterrence, but we haven't heard 10 years down the line, we haven't heard anything about the uh, China Ukraine nuclear factor in the light of the Russian threats to use nuclear weapons in Ukrainian conflict. So this is still a topic that is not raised in Chinese websites, in the think tanks, but one doesn't know what exactly is cooking on that front. Of course, Yanukovych is not around in terms of pursuing this, but this is a state-to-state agreement, and hence it is of some interest for us to discuss this aspect. There is the Foreign Minister Wang Yi at the time speaking to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization General Secretary Chang Ming last March, saying that China is for resolute opposition to the revival of Cold War mentality. This word is again coming back in the joint statement between Putin and Xi Jinping last week, and so this is very important. However, Chinese ambassador to Ukraine was singing a different song. Fan Xianrong, for example, he said that China would continue to assist Ukraine in its development and respect the path chosen by the Ukrainians because this is a sovereign right of every nation, quote unquote. Ambassador Fan's comments are seen to being neutral. However, that is not so. And hence, this reflects to the Chinese tension on choosing between Moscow and Kiev. Finally, I would say that the February 24, 2023 position that China took on Ukraine has 12 points for a mediatory role. These are quite revealing on China's position on Ukrainian conflict. So let me briefly touch upon those 12 points and wind up this discussion and wait for the Q&A. Number one is respecting the sovereignty of all countries. But as I just explained, China's position on sovereignty is full of double standards, as we saw in Galwan in 2020, and also on other issues like Senkaku Islands, the South China Sea. South China Sea, for example, the Permanent Court of Arbitration ruled out any sovereign claim by the Chinese based on historical claims. That was the ruling in July 2016. Yet, the Chinese insist still on sovereignty. So there is a lot of double standard by China on the sovereignty claim. And so this is not a credible aspect when the Chinese dish out on the first element of the 12 point as focusing on respecting the sovereignty. It sounds good, but in practice, China had not been implementing that aspect. The second is abandoning the Cold War mentality. Ironically, China actually has a Cold War mentality when it comes to South Asia, when it comes to Southeast Asia, East Asia, and West Asia. Increasingly, there is a Cold War mentality we have been living with Chinese Cold War mentality in South Asian region. And so the suggestion in the 12 point that somebody else has Cold War mentality is quite surprising for an Indian. The third is ceasing hostilities. Um, uh, China waged this war or a skirmish on India in Galwan, and we have 17 core commander level meetings so far, and a WMCC meeting that has been conducted a few months ago. So India is negotiating with China, talking to China. However, China's position has been, as the Chinese would say, as Mao Zedong would say, tan tan tan, ta ta ta, which basically means keep talking but use force, military force. So this concept, the third point that China raises, that ceasing hostility, and the fourth point, resuming peace talks, doesn't gel with the reality here in the India-China context, or in South China Sea or Senkaku Islands. So this appears again a very specious argument from China on the third and fourth points in the 12-point agenda. Fifth is they mention about resolving the humanitarian crises. Sixth, protecting civilians and prisoners of war, and keeping the nuclear power plants safe, reducing strategic risks, facilitating grain exports, as Russia and Ukraine are the one of the main wheat exporters, major wheat exporters to the globe, stopping unilateral sanctions, keeping industrial and supply chains stable, and promoting post-conflict reconstruction. The last point is also interesting because much of the reconstruction in Iraq today is being done by the Chinese. So actually, China sees Ukrainian conflict as an opportunity for its industry, for its state-owned enterprises, that it can jump into the reconstruction aspect and see this as a business opportunity. I would suggest the Chinese perceptions on the Ukrainian conflict has so many double standards, and they view this as an opportunity rather than as a humanitarian crisis and a problematic for the global and regional orders. The Ukrainian conflict, like the COVID-19, have disrupted the old order substantially, and this is leading to a new order. We do not know what the ABCDs of that new order are. And so both of these, Ukrainian conflict as well as the COVID-19 and the supply chain disruptions, these have resulted in huge thinking across the globe on what is at the end of the tunnel. Let me stop here and take questions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor. It was a brilliant multi-dimensional analysis of China's culture on Green Book from pretty much every angle. Indeed, very informative, very educational about the whole problem. We have questions and answers coming from the chat function, but before I go to the question and answer from the audience, I have a couple of comments/questions. Towards the end, you came to that particular issue that China is looking for opportunity in every crisis. And the next result is that due to this war and due to the destruction of the United States and NATO, China has, as an opportunist, as an hegemon, become the neck for instability in the Middle East, bringing out Iran and Saudi Arabia together. That tells you, like you mentioned, that China has all the concepts of reconstruction in China is actually using its prices to extend its footprint in the Middle East or Ghana region. Basically, expertise they have a global and comments on that.
I just explained Arvindji's question that China will never give any contracts. Already Chinese companies are functioning in Ukraine in food delivery, in telecommunications, and so on. So we shouldn't close that option on that front.
Okay. There was a question from Mr. Uncle Desai that you have already addressed. Is China providing arms and military protection for security to the force order? And if yes, what is that mandate? I about it, you made mention about it. I think you want to address it again. Please go ahead.
Yes, I did explain that there are some reports Russia. As you know, there is an agreement between Russia and China on the Su-35. But the Russian aviation industry, AVIC, Aviation Industrial Corporation, has huge logistics and other backup. They're also good now. And so this is one area where the Russians are interested in, especially as the war, the aviation components are being sought after. Number two is the drones. Chinese cannot hide any platform being used in Ukrainian conflict by Russia. But nevertheless, once these equipment are shot, once these equipment are taken by the Ukrainians, the evidence would become more evident. What the Chinese are doing at the moment is to supply systems to Russia, according to these reports. There is also as I just mentioned, the Changsha-based organization had supplied some satellite pictures. As you know, the Chinese have launched several Peito series of satellites with GPS. They call this compass system. And their accuracy rates have really increased. And so possible dependence on China by Russia in this. These are some, but we do not have any concrete evidence. There was a report some time ago that some Russian transport aircraft landed in China and a lot of contingency. We do not have clear evidence in this regard. So on the arms supplies, this is quite possible, as you also mentioned. Mr. Amod Desai mentioned between Northeast and China. But these are all mainly done on the aviation front. So it is quite likely that these could be transported. But we have no clear evidence in this regard.
The question from Dr. within post-Ukraine scenario, we agree for the emergence of Russia currently on its.
Yes, on the Chinese mediation and India's role, I think we have been relatively quiet, partly because of India's dependence on Russia on the military inventory and recent energy imports that India made from Russia. And again, the mediatory efforts with Ukraine. So there is India is more an honest broker here in this case rather than China. Despite the shortcomings that India has, basically in terms of the recent, imports from Russia. President Biden, in the third Quad meeting, virtual meeting, mentioned to Prime Minister Modi for his support on Ukraine. Prime Minister Modi mentioned in this Quad meeting that Ukraine is continental, while the Quad is focusing on the maritime issues. So it appears to be more diplomatic, that posturing, but increasingly, as the war continues, India would also be dragged in finding a solution. As the inflation is rising across the board for every country and including for India, although under wraps right now, yet it is not foreseeable. Secondly, if India is saying that it wants to have a 6% to 7% growth rate, it can't see conflict going on in the other theater because that would be detrimental to the economic development as well. So I think that was what Prime Minister Modi's statement to a conversation with President Putin, that this is not an era of war. And so we need to focus more on the economy front. So that is possibly one aspect. But sooner than later, I think India has to revise and has to jump in terms of the mediatory role. At the moment, it is the blocs that have been looking at, as India has been stressing on the global south in the last several years, and in the light of the G20 meeting as well. There is the focus on the impact of Ukrainian war rather than mediation. That is how I read here in this process.
There is a question from Mr. Nehru. There is a serious risk of China undermining Russia-India relationship by Russia, Indian, and India.
One question on the serious risk of China undermining Russia and Russia-India relations. This is a major concern for India, and Indian diplomacy focused on not making Moscow-Beijing axis strengthened, but emphasizing that we have concerns on China, specifically on the territorial dispute and in the Indian Ocean region, in terms of the Chinese Navy entry into the Indian Ocean region. So these two concerns have led India to stress with Russia that relations with China need to be modulated, and they need to be. So India has been stressing, for example, Russia should not transfer more critical technologies to China. For example, the turbofan engines. Russia should not export arms to Pakistan, and so on and so forth. So in reality, Russia did obey the Indian concerns. For example, the Su-30 MKI and MKK. MKK has been transferred to China, which is less combat, sophisticated than compared with the MKI, which was supplied to India. So the MKI has also the Israeli avionics, head-up display systems, and others. So Russia did obey the Indian concerns when it came to China, but one doesn't know the Ukrainian war will result in a complete shift of or complete dependence of Russia on China in the near future. That's a major concern. If China, Russia come together, that's also bad news for New Delhi because of the kind of sophisticated weapon systems that can be sent to China, which obviously will have an impact on Indian security.
There is a question from Aaron Reyes. Given ERC, KIA, international boundaries, institutions, agreements, treaties, etc. Then it's if the PRC clearly extends support for Russia in the war in Ukraine, what will be the response to China's support for Russia from the EU, Japan? It's a long question.
If PRC expands support for Russia in the war in Ukraine, what will the response to China's support for Russia from EU, US, Japan? I still was not able to understand this question.
I think you already answered the question.
Mr. Reyes, can you please raise that question if possible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yep. So my question is, if China PRC PLA move beyond the sort of in the gray zone as a supporter of the war in Ukraine from a Russian perspective, what do you perceive or see as the follow-on responses from the EU, from the US, from Japan? In essence, the G7, whether it's financial sanctions, any type of next phase malign actor kind of response. And once again, thank you, Doctor, for your fantastic presentation.
Thank you very much. I think, I now got the
recording in progress.
Yeah, well, as you know, the European Union had stated in 1999 in the NATO 50th anniversary, they focus on more religious and other issues. And 2019, they mentioned that China is a competitor and a cooperative partner. However, a year ago, the European Union considered China as a systemic rival. And Ukrainian conflict widened that spectrum of differences between EU and China. Although the including German president and others, they have been in touch with China as well on the conflict. However, there is also the problem that China poses for Europe within. After Lithuania established the Taiwan office, the Lithuanian ambassador has been thrown out of Beijing. And this aspect has widened the China-EU differences. Number two, specifically on Ukraine, EU wants some specific commitments from China, but that is not forthcoming from China, and hence the systemic rival aspect is increasing between EU and China. The third aspect is all this is having an impact on CEC 17. As you know, about a decade ago, China had floated the CEEC, that is China, East Europe, Central Europe multilateral format. And the Lithuanian situation, the Baltic states positions, this has created differences between China and the CEEC 17. And secondly, Germany, France, and other main European countries are also opposing China's financial investments in EU because of their caustic impact. So in the light of this, the EU is circumspect on China in many ways, although their bilateral economic relations and trading relations, etc., are growing, number one. Number two, on US, the United States had mentioned Russia and China as the strategic competitors. Number two, for China, they mentioned about outcompeting China. So while it appears that the 4 summit meetings online or phone calls between President Biden and President Xi relatively were good for the bilateral relations. Yet the fundamental aspect is again on Ukraine. As President Biden mentioned, that China should not provide any material support to Russia in this war. Overall, the Chinese appear to have abided by this. But when you look at the recent statement by President Xi Jinping in the National People's Congress, directly mentioning United States as an adversary and other events, it indicated that we are going to see a more active competition between United States and China in the coming years, with possibly major impact on Ukrainian conflict as well. So this is one aspect of the China-US. On Japan, it's quite interesting that Prime Minister Kishida, soon after the India trip, had landed in Ukraine. And interestingly, also, he had mentioned about the financial assistance and various other measures in order to beef up the Japan-Ukraine relations. On the other hand, quite strangely, we see Russia-China joint statement on March 21st, 4 days ago, mentions about the Japanese utilization of nuclear materials and their dumping in waters. So this has been mentioned as a part of the joint statement between Russia and China. Secondly, Russia and China have been conducting joint exercises, which has been reiterated in the joint statement. Most important, during the Quad meeting on May 22nd last year, Russia and China conducted a naval exercise closer to the Japanese territory as a counter to the Quad, posturing. So the Russia-China jointness in this regard is a major, concern for Japan. As you know, Japan had stated that nuclear forces deployment in Taiwan Straits is essential to deter China in the Taiwan Straits invasion. Number two, the Japanese have been supplying fast attack craft to Vietnam, Philippines, and their destroyer, Izumo, had gone into that area, which indicate that today Japan is now planning to kind of have a role in the Taiwan Straits. So this also resulted in a lot of Chinese criticism of Japan. So I guess that should explain your question related to EU, US, and Japan, and in the background of the Ukraine conflict.
I see that Ambassador Kapoor had raised his hand. Ambassador Kapoor, can you come and ask for a question or give your comment, please? Ambassador Kapoor, kindly unmute yourself.
Thank you very much. Very good to hear Professor Kondapalli and the brilliant analysis. Just give me 1 minute. I'll switch off the other call. So, and I enjoyed every minute of your talk, Professor Kondapalli. It was such a great learning experience. Your granular detail into so many issues is absolutely phenomenal. What I want to ask is, if you were the leader and the decision maker of the US administration, what would your approach be on this issue in terms of minimizing the damage to your own interests in the long term and to your allies' interests in the long term?
Thank you very much, Ambassador Kapoor, and that's very tantalizing question. As we are in the midst of the conflict, and there is a $5 billion aid that the US Congress had supported. is also the German defense budget rising to about $200 odd billion. We have seen material supplies to Ukraine continuing. There is the offensive in some parts of Ukraine against Russia. So in this scenario, we are actually in the midst of war, and if the U.S. administrations have to carry forward a plan B, that would be quite counterproductive because the war is ongoing. So this would be number one. That is to continue what has been there already. So that's number one response the U.S. administration should do. Number two, obviously, I think there is very less attention paid to the China, Russia, South Africa, other countries, what they are doing at this point of time. For example, there is the South Africa, Russia, China naval exercise that was conducted about, I think, 10, 15 days ago. So that should be raising alarm bells in terms of the Cape of Good Hope and other areas. Number two, there is not enough, publicity given in the Ukrainian conflict about the collateral damage, women, children, and so on and so forth. This is definitely against the just war traditions that were mentioned in the various UN conventions and other conventions. So there is very less attention paid on this aspect, and so I think that needs to be put across. The third is, of course, on the wider impact that is having on the three things that India is concerned or other countries are concerned: energy prices, food prices, fertilizer prices. I think there ought to be a global response in this regard. Specifically, if you need support base, the global south need to be factored in. All that offering under these three Fs: food, fertilizer, fuel aspects, that needs to be factored in the US response. Fourthly, I would suggest the economic dimension. We have not seen the Build Back Better world gaining traction. We have not seen the US international development projects. Former Secretary of State Pompeo mentioned about the $120 billion or so of the investment in infrastructure projects. That has not really taken off as I see. So I think these grant projects in the background of Ukrainian conflict would provide for some track and a positive and a productive kind of background for this conflict. So I think in Plan B that needs to be emphasized. What are the actual deliverables in the Build Back Better world? That needs to be, while there is this conflict going on, there is a need for looking at these broader aspects as well in order to trigger the economic growth rates. Ukraine should not result in recession globally, and for the United States, for its allies, and also to the global south. So I would suggest that the parallel track of the economic growth rates that also need to be factored in.
The next question is from another question about Beijing. Do you see the possibility of China hardening its position on LSD if Ukraine conflict roll on? And for China use this crisis to take incursions for trying to change the identity of states? Both the questions didn't get it. And British in the chat room.
Do you foresee the possibility of China hardening its position on LAC if Ukraine conflict prolongs? I want to take up this question. So far, there is no signaling from China on whether the Galwan crisis would be resolved. We have not seen any signaling. But because President Xi Jinping has to come to New Delhi for the G20 as well as the SEO meetings, there has been some talk, and we do not know whether that translates into any major progress in the Galwan situation. India's position is unless until peace and tranquility prevails on the border, there cannot be any bilateral relations. As Dr. Jaishankar articulated on June 17th, 2 days, 1.5 days after the soldiers were there is suggestion from Dr. Jaishankar, the External Affairs Minister. The Chinese position is forget about the border, let's evolve the bilateral relations. This is not acceptable to the Indian side. And so the discussions continued and they remain mainly without any progress. So on the other hand, we also have the actual mobilization by the military forces on either side. It is estimated that China had mobilized 70,000 troops in the Western sector, and India mobilized over 120,000 troops in the Western sector, and also beefed up across the line of actual control. You may have heard about the December 9th incident in Yangtze in Taiwan. So that indicates that across the line of actual control, the 3,488 kilometer long border, that is now militarized. So will China take this as an opportunity? I think if the Chinese realize that things are getting tough for them, because we have seen nearly 2.5 years of mobilization by either side. China faced a lot of casualties. Some reports suggested China lost some 69 people, including a Western Theater Command commander, although they said he passed away with cancer. But the terrain is so harsh, oxygen content is so less, that only battle-hardened soldiers can stay in that region. Since India has the experience of high altitude operations, since the Siachen control, the Chinese do not have similar warfare experience, operational experience. So they faced a lot of problem in terms of weather and other operational issues, while India has been sitting pretty in that area. So on your question of possibility of China hardening the position, yes, so far we have not seen any flexibility in the Chinese position in any of the core commander level meetings or the WMCC meeting. If conflict prolongs, this is also likely to be one area. However, I wanted to say that China is trying to invade Taiwan, one scenario. China has the South China Sea related mobilization. Thirdly, they also have Senkaku Islands. 600 odd transgressions take place by the Chinese Air Force and the Coast Guard on the Senkaku Islands. So China is too stretched out on all the four fronts, while India is very well prepared on the that it is intending to fight. And the Western Front has been relatively quiet, except for a few terrorist incidents. So in other words, India is focused on China. while China is focused on 4 fronts. So that is taking a heavy toll on the Chinese at the moment. So if China hardens its position on the LAC and Ukrainian conflict prolongs, then it is actually also problematic for China in the longer run. So that's my response to this.
Another question about India and strategic relationship. If this rise is prolonged and the Chinese forces are hardened, what are the comments on that?
Is it on the BRI or on the Russian land forces and other? Okay, I will take up these 2 questions on the performance of the Russian forces in Ukraine and what does that mean for the Chinese Air Force. It is still not clear whether they will provide limited support to Russia. This would be in the United States. We did see cracks emerging, but we have not seen in the background of the banking crisis in the US, we have not seen any Chinese withdrawal from the US Treasury securities. As you know, China had invested $1.2 trillion, in the securities, but there is no withdrawal by China in this. Second, the problem for China would also be aggravated in the Taiwan Straits, South China Sea, and Senkaku Islands, which have some alliance provisions between the US and these countries concerned. So, in other words, China has to imagine a scenario where they will have a full-fledged conflict with the United States. At the moment, China is not prepared for this. So, in other words, China supporting the Russian Air Force or others is unthinkable at this point of time. What we are seeing is limited support, diplomatic support, strategic support from China to Russia as a quid pro quo on Ukraine and Taiwan. At the moment, we see this scenario. We do not see Chinese active military support to Russia. In the background of President Biden's, warning to China. So I'm not very sure whether they would escalate into providing air force support to the Russians. On Japan strategic ties, when Prime Minister Kishida visited New Delhi last week, we have had several agreements, and most important thing is the body language between Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Kishida. They appear to be relaxed. They appear to be, looking at various aspects in a more constructive manner. For example, the kind of assistance that Japan is planning to invest in the northeast of India in the infrastructure projects, not just India, but also Bangladesh. That is quite commendable in terms of the growth rates that we are going to witness. So in 4 fields, one is in the maritime domain, second is in the space program, third is in the BMD, the missile defense program, and fourth in the economic and technological aspects, in which Japan had invested heavily, and several projects are there, like the Ahmedabad to Mumbai high-speed railway, several energy projects, clean energy projects, and so on and so forth. It is estimated that Japan is planning to invest over $120 billion in such infrastructure projects. So that's quite a large, investment, and it appears the line that Shinzo Abe took, that is still in implementation stage in Japan relations. There is one question on the BRI. Yes. Japan has been critical of the BRI on the issues related to quality infrastructure and debts, environmental issues. India is critical of the BRI on 4 counts: lack of transparency, debt diplomacy, third, the sovereignty and territorial integrity issues being affected with the CPEC projects, and fourthly, on I think I mentioned all the 4. So India and Japan have also evolved a response to this. For example, there is the AAGC, Asia Africa Growth Corridor, that Japan, Indonesia, and India are trying to cobble up. Nothing really happened, but that is an idea that they want to also include the African countries in the process of this economic connectivity and so on. Second, there is the India-Japan initiatives related to quality infrastructure that I just mentioned in the northeast of India or other infrastructure projects. There is the Japanese with their own free and open Indo-Pacific, and the Indian ones. There isn't much friction between the two, India and Japan. In fact, there are more areas of convergence than divergence. And so for foreseeable future, we may possibly see this continuing, including the supply chain resilience initiative that was signed a year ago. And digitalization as a part of that, digitalization of trade is being undertaken. So I see a lot of prospect in India-Japan relations and more probing actions. For example, Indian Air Force, Indian Army conducted separate exercises with their counterparts in Japan. This has not happened before, but this has been a major highlight just last month. And there is a proposal for India buying the amphibious aircraft from Japan. That is still problematic because of the domestic Japanese problems like the constitution, because the Japanese constitution mentions about no exports of arms. And so we got stuck there, but I guess that would be overcome in the near future with some other provisions like without weapons, the platform can be transferred to India. So that is one that we are currently discussing. Again, there are so many other issues in the defense field, like Mitsubishi, Toshiba, and others are in discussions with the Indian defense establishments, especially in the aviation industry, maritime, in the minesweepers, and others. So I see a lot of scope for India, Japan moving in that direction. Trade is also booming, investments booming. I think there is a lot of progress there on that front.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Professor Honorary, for very brilliant presentation and very fruitful discussion. Thank you once again. We are very pleased to you, and we hope that we will come again. My thanks for Indian members. I know there were some technical issues. My voice was not audible. And I also thankful to the CSA that was in the background for the entire presentation. And with this heartfelt thanks to Professor Kondapalli, I am going to end this. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much.